All right, listen up, RotoGrinders. It's the ownership report here at RotoGrinders.com. My name is Chris Gimino, projected ownership analyst for RG, and joining me to go over the Week 12 NFL DFS main slate is DFS extraordinaire, STL Cards 84, Justin Van Zuiden. Justin, what's going on, man? Are you ready to get this done? It's not the best slate for a Week 12, to be honest with you.
Yeah, it's not. Happy to be here. Appreciate the reminder earlier. I knew that Dan was going to be out, and Devin asked me a while ago to fill in, and of course I remembered for most of the 2-week period that I knew I was going to be filling in here, and slipped my mind over the holidays. So got the reminder this morning, and we got all ready to go. So and it is the Thanksgiving week slate. The main slate is always maybe a little more underwhelming. We still got a couple teams on buys. Obviously, we had 3 Thursday games, which takes a couple games off the main slate. So a little more condensed pool of games, and not a lot of games that just scream ownership and shootout. As far as game stacks and GPPs, I think we've only got one game above about 49 points this week. So should be an interesting week to run through the strategy. I think there's a few different ways you can handle it this week, and this is a week where if you do the research, it often pays off. It's a short turnaround from a Thursday slate to Sunday on a holiday week. So definitely one where I think we can get an edge.
Very few mispricings out there on the DFS sites these days. You might find a handful on Yahoo, but you come over to DraftKings, and they're just about as good as anyone at projecting the players and coming up with the price points on these guys. So it's really a good, solid, tough week of lineup building ahead of us here for this Sunday afternoon. Now, if you look at the quarterback position, that's where it starts, and you've got very few standout plays at the position. You've got, no Patrick Mahomes, no Lamar Jackson. Top projected player for us is Tom Brady right now. Not too many other guys above 20 fantasy points in our projections at the moment. And the ownership is going to lead us in the direction of Cam Newton, who's back and running touchdowns into the end zone. It's like he never left in terms of, the way that he's operating in Carolina. Over 20 fantasy points projected for him right now. Over 14% ownership is the reason for that is his price point here. Do you have any problem with him being the chalkiest tournament player? I think in cash games, of course, he's going to lead into an optimal build pretty easily here. But do you think for tournaments it's a mistake to trust Cam Newton against the Dolphins?
I don't. I mean, and we don't, it's not like it's 25, 30% ownership. So, and I was kind of looking into this a little bit, and teams are throwing the ball 40 times a game on Miami, which is a little bit weird. I mean, you consider that Miami's a pretty bad team. You figure teams get a lead against them and run the ball a lot, but that hasn't been the case. I think in terms of opposing passing attempts per game, it's been Seattle and Miami are the two that are above 40. So, I think this is a game where you could see that dual threat upside from Cam a little bit more. Some people tend to play him without, pairing him with a receiver in tournaments. Maybe that's one way to make your Newton lineups a little bit different in GPPs. But based on the salary on DraftKings, I mean, you mentioned there's not a lot of mispricings on DK right now. I think this is one. Newton at 5,600, he's 8K on FanDuel, so you don't necessarily need him over there. But given the way he's looked and the opponent, I don't think I'll be fading Cam Newton at that salary this week.
I think certainly my position here with Carolina at Miami is that they're going to be on the road here. It's the Miami defense has the potential to be one of the tougher defenses in the league. The Carolina offense, especially with Cam at quarterback, has the potential to slow down quite a bit. They've got Christian McCaffrey back there. They're yak guys as far as their wide receivers are concerned. We don't know for sure what Cam's arm is going to look like. I mean, he used to be able to throw the deep ball pretty good.
Robbie Anderson's not going to catch it anyway.
Yeah, so this is what I'm getting to. So, the look of this offense against Miami, and then of course you flip Miami going back against the tough Carolina defense. I just have a problem seeing if he's going to be on the higher side of ownership, that being the absolute best play you can make if you're making just a couple of lineups, right? So I'm not saying bad play for Cam Newton here, but I am saying that I think you can probably get more creative on a week where there's very few concentrated ownerships to begin with, right? Like, you look at the rest of the quarterback position, it's spread out as usual, but even you'll see in the other positions, it's priced so tight on DraftKings that there's just not going to be, we're not going to see 45% owned players on this slate like we saw on Thanksgiving, right? We're not going to see, I think, if you played NBA last night, you're not going to see 50% owned Anthony Edwards on this slate. That's just not happening. So again, Justin Herbert might be the next highest owned guy here. It's close between him and Brady. The problem with Brady is he's 7,600, and you put Brady with either one of those top receivers or Gronk even, who's he's the cheapest of the bunch, but you're still not getting away with a minimum salary guy. That stack's going to start to get expensive real quick, and certainly people are going to want to try to bring it back with Jonathan Taylor on the other side. So it's getting tough to afford Brady here. Do you think any of these other quarterbacks belong ahead of Herbert and Brady in terms of ownership, or are these the next two guys for you?
I mean, I think they will be the next two in terms of ownership. I'll give Brady a slight edge. I worry about that game in Denver maybe being a little slow paced, particularly if Denver's able to keep it close. I think they'll try to slow that game down. So I don't have a problem with Herbert, but I think if I'm prioritizing one, I do prefer getting some exposure to Brady. So, and that $7,600 tag, I think will scare maybe a little bit of people away just because it is tight on DraftKings. So I think you'll see maybe Herbert at 1,000 cheaper come in with a little more popularity, but Brady is probably my next priority. I'll be underweight on Herbert, I think.
And unless you're in love with a guy in Dez Fitzpatrick, who was like, he was barely getting time in preseason when we were covering that earlier. He got cut. He definitely wasn't standing out at Titans camp at all. He's there as a process of elimination pretty much in that receiving core. The reason I mention is because he's 3,200, and you can start to get some of these stacked with, doubles with Brady and, Godwin, if you're trying to get both of them in there, a lot easier. But that's why he's not, I think he would be the highest owned quarterback if it was easier to afford him. That's basically
agreed. Yeah. If there was more obvious 3K value, you'd see more people on him for sure.
Yeah, and people aren't going to fall in love with Dez Fitzpatrick, that's for sure. Okay, so Tyrod Taylor is the guy that I've got next on my list here as far as garnering some ownership. He did run for a couple of touchdowns last week, but more importantly, he's 5,300, and the matchup against the Jets is going to look appealing to most people. Projections like him quite a bit. I was going to leave this to you. Tyrod Taylor is a player that I feel like I'm too biased to have a strong opinion about right now. How are you viewing him right now? If the numbers geeks are right, is this a good play in week number 12?
Yeah, I think he is. I mean, I think he's a reasonable pivot away from Cam at 300 cheaper. They don't have any good goal line running backs, so he's just as good of a candidate to run it in. And we've seen that Jets defense just give up yards in droves at times. I mean, Buffalo, in the midst of Buffalo's struggles, they still put up a bunch of yards against the Jets. We saw Indy put up a ton of yards against the Jets. And this is actually, Houston's looked more competent the last few weeks. They beat Tennessee, obviously. So I think, if there's a spot where I'm comfortable rostering Taylor this year, this is probably it at 5,300 on DK against the Jets.
Still waiting for a particular player in this team to sort of break out of his show. Maybe this is the week, but this is certainly a decent matchup, and we'll talk about a couple of the players on this team going forward through the other positions. Now, Stafford, no longer with the aid of Robert Woods. The matchup with Green Bay is, I wouldn't call it a tough matchup, but it's, is there a situation here where Stafford should be higher owned than he is right now? His prop is not that high. The projection is not that high. It's really a different place than we were just a couple of weeks ago with the Rams, where, he was pretty much a lock for 300 yards. Are we underselling Matthew Stafford in this spot against Green Bay?
I think it depends on how you feel about his secondary receivers, because Cooper Kupp is $9,600 on DraftKings, and that's just a ridiculous price tag. And if you're a believer in Beckham and Jefferson being able to replace that production from Robert Woods, I think Stafford is reasonable. I have my doubts. I mean, the Packers defense has looked a lot better recently, save last week's game against the Vikings where they didn't, but otherwise they'd been pretty good for a couple of months. It's a road game for the Rams. It's cold in Green Bay. And this time of year, I mean, Stafford played for years with the Lions indoors, playing for Los Angeles. You're playing in a warm weather environment. And I know he's used to playing outdoors in Chicago and Green Bay and, this time of year, but I don't know. I don't trust those secondary receivers, and I don't love stacking them with Kupp because Kupp's so expensive. So by process of just that reasoning, I think I don't love Stafford here, but on its own merit, I suppose I don't mind it, but I don't think it's necessary. I'd rather pay 500 more for Brady.
He'll get a couple of looks. I mean, there's a possibility that this number's inflated just a little bit here at 7%. Maybe he checks in at 5% or something like that, but I don't think he'll be in the super, super low tier of options this week. He'll fall somewhere among this next group of guys, right? So you've got Stafford, and I think probably some combination of Matt Ryan, Jalen Hurts, Garoppolo, Joe Burrow, Daniel Jones, and maybe Cousins sneaks in there just because they've been playing in so many high-scoring affairs. I mention it like every week on the show. Like just the number of times that the Vikings end up just like creating these amazing game environments. It's not just this year too. I remember last year there was a couple of games where just suddenly a Vikings game turns into like a 80-point affair. Like, is this situation here where any of these other guys has any potential to become chalky secretly? Because this happens every year where there's a guy you think is going to be 4% owned and he's 9 and 10% owned just because he fits the roster construction on a tight week. Any of those guys fit the bill?
I don't think so. I think we got it about right. Hurts would have been the choice for me, but now that he's up to 7,300, he was 6,500 3 weeks ago, 6,800 a couple weeks ago. He was up to 7,300 last week and wasn't very highly owned against the Saints, but salvaged the rushing touchdowns. I don't think so. I think Hurts will be a little higher owned on the other sites, but on DraftKings, I think we got it about right in terms of that ownership. And you mentioned it, and I put it in my article this week that my favorite of the kind of these lower owned guys is Cousins because of what we see a lot from the Vikings and what we saw last week. And the fact, that game has the second highest total on the slate. We mentioned it from the top. It's not the most exciting main slate, but we got a 49-point total there, and the Vikings often end up in these shootout type of games. So, Cousins at 4%, I think, is the guy, and maybe others take that path too. And he becomes the guy that ends up being a little more popular, but he's the guy I'm kind of planting my flag on there to be overweight.
I think with the return of George Kittle and Brandon Ayuk, I don't think Garoppolo is going to be sneaky at all. Again, if we're talking about, is he going to be 4%? Okay, that's fine. But I still think he's going to, when you start talking about the quarterback position, on a week this spread out, and again, it's usually spread out at quarterback, but I just don't think you're going to find yourself totally alone with your Garoppolo stacks. I think he'll be at least moderately popular, but I think we've already spent too much time talking about quarterback just based on the fact that you're not going to gain a ton of game theory advantage merely from your quarterback selection by itself. I think you have to dig a little bit deeper into these other positions to look for spots with ownership to find an advantage. Would you agree with that, Justin?
I would. Yes. I think you got that spot on.
Speaking of finding an advantage, you might want to try to find an advantage this week, Justin, on Thrive Fantasy. Now, you haven't been here to talk about, getting the whole family involved like I have with Tuttle's family. He's with his family now. He should be down there selling Thrive Fantasy to all of them. Come prop up on Thrive Fantasy this season. It's a daily fantasy and esports app for player props. With Thrive, you can eliminate the countless hours of research and focus on just the top tier athletes that have the biggest impact on the game. Choose 10 out of 20 available players to build your lineup. Each prop's going to get assigned over and under. You go ahead and get a lineup of 10 guys to, based on how likely it is to hit the most props and rack up the most fantasy, points, and you're going to win your share of the prize pool. Use promo code GRINDERS when you sign up today. Receive 100% instant first deposit match up to $250 plus 2 free $20 contest tickets with a $10 deposit, 4 free $20 contest tickets with a $100 to $499 deposit. And Justin, if you have got the big bucks, like I know you've got, you can get 6 free $20 tickets for $500 deposit over at Thrive Fantasy. So you might want to check that out. Download the Thrive Fantasy app on the App Store or the Play Store by visiting thrivefantasy.com. Sign up and prop up today. Running back position. Okay, so normally we find somebody at the running back position that's like, yep, this is the play. This is the standout. This is the guy that's going to get the ownership. Justin, I'm looking at what's going on this week, and I don't see it, man. I got Miles Sanders up top, 5,100 on DraftKings. Maybe you'll see some, some other guys on other sites pop up a little bit higher, but man, it's tight out there at running back. Who am I supposed to love?
Not Miles Sanders and GPPs. Every time he's the chalk, he stinks. So, but the salary cap poses some constraints this week. So I think that's why that ownership is going to congregate there. I'm just probably not going to do it in GPPs. He's yet to burn people, it seems like, whenever he's chalky. So, yeah, it's tough. I mean, the top plays are pricey. And the mid-tier plays all have risk, like Barkley. Who knows how many touches he's going to get? Ty Johnson, how many touches is he going to get? How healthy is James Robinson? So it's iffy for me, but I think the logic behind that then just is in GPPs, you swerve away from the chalk because it's unpredictable. So yeah, Sanders, not a guy I love it if he's going to be the most popular.
Looking at schedule adjusted fantasy points and our RotoGrinders power rankings for the matchup, I mean, I guess both of these guys, Sanders and Robinson, have decent matchups on teams that are relatively good at running the ball. I shouldn't say run. Certainly the Eagles are. I wouldn't say the Jaguars are good at running the ball, but they're getting production running the ball. And I would qualify it as, I mean, it makes sense that they're getting drafted as the highest owned guys, but as you mentioned, it's a week where it's going to be tough to fall in love with anybody. And certainly if these are going to be the highest owned guys, especially in higher buy-in contests, maybe you can slide down the list just a little bit. What are you going to do with like Christian McCaffrey here? 9K, not the best matchup in the world against Miami. And, Cam Newton's in town to steal those touchdowns. How do you feel about McCaffrey?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of dovetails with how you're handling Newton. If you're out on Newton and GPPs and you think, he's going to be too chalky, then you can get some leverage and play McCaffrey. Or if you think Carolina's just not going to be able to produce points at all, then you just fade the whole group. But, we saw him. He's back the last 2 weeks, with Newton under center, 18 targets, 17 catches, 126 receiving yards, 50 fantasy points. So, I mean, that's all what we're used to over the years from Christian McCaffrey. So, and he's even pairable with Newton if you want to trust that receiving production, and fade the wide receivers that are inconsistent for them. So, yeah, I like McCaffrey. It's tough to build with him. I do like him a little bit more than Jonathan Taylor, I think, but all told, if I was doing a 3-max or I was just building a single bullet, they're probably priced out, Taylor and McCaffrey, at 9K plus on DraftKings. I think I'd probably go a little bit cheaper, especially when you consider ownership.
Darrell Henderson might slip in here because he's 5.8 against Green Bay on the road. Projection not nearly as high as it was earlier in the season. The problem is there's just not a lot of guys that we're looking to. So would you rather play Myles Gaskin? Would you rather play Leonard Fournette, Aaron Jones? I mean, he's coming back possibly this week. It's questionable as of right now. So, I mean, do you have any faith in any of these guys in the same price range? Or are we going to basically have a lot of lineups defaulting to Darrell Henderson just because there's not a better option?
Yeah, I think you'll get a lot of lineups that go to Henderson, particularly if you want to play the game flow angle. I think you play the game flow angle. You think the Rams might play with a lead. You take Henderson, you run it back with Devontae Adams, and you try to go for game flow from that perspective. Or if you think Green Bay is going to play with the lead, you can reverse it and play Cooper Kupp, but pending Aaron Jones status there. But I like Henderson at that salary. We know in a competitive game, he's going to get his touches, like the San Francisco game you could throw out. They got blitzed in that game. And he did have 6 passing game targets. So yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about the game logs the last few weeks where they've had to play from behind. I like him. I don't think he's a must, but I think he's reasonably safe.
Once you get past Henderson, then we're starting to talk about mid to lower tier owned guys. I think Barkley's going to get some ownership. Patterson's going to get ownership. And, Jonathan Taylor, I mean, how many touchdowns does this guy have to have before he starts to get owned? He's 9,100, of course. So you get the 5 touchdowns, people are going to want to play it, but then also 9,100 gets a little tough there. Do you think you should be splitting more of the ownership with McCaffrey at least? I mean, is it unfair just because it's versus Tampa Bay to be, sliding McCaffrey's way just because of what we perceive to be a tough matchup?
I don't think so, particularly on DraftKings, where the receiving production has more value. I think it's about right. I think you can make that case in half PPR formats just because of the touchdown equity from Taylor. But yeah, I mean, I played him last week. I ran him back with Diggs, and Diggs scored a couple touchdowns, so that worked out. I just think this is the week at that salary where I'm probably out. Like, he's got to have another huge game to burn you. And granted, he's got a touchdown in 8 straight games now. But I think this is the week where maybe it's a little bit tougher for him. Taylor, I'm probably Xing out for better or worse. At that salary, I don't think this is the week where you lose a GPP because he scores 3+ touchdowns.
If you're into coach speak, Justin, Coach Frank Reich said not only does he not want to reduce Jonathan Taylor's workload, but he wants to try to increase. I'm like, increase it.
That makes it
increase the workload. Where's that coming from? All right. I mean, look, I'm God bless you. I can't say for sure I'm going to X him up, but I understand on DraftKings it's tough to get 9,100 in there, and there are certainly some other ways to spend the salary that you might want to look at. Okay, so you mentioned some injured guys like Barkley. What's his workload going to be like? Are we going to see Cordell Patterson against the Jaguars? I mean, that could, earlier in the season, if we saw that at full health, we'd be excited about that. He's not going to be particularly owned at 6.5 here. I mean, if Patterson is in the lineup, are you going to be expecting him to be full go?
Yeah, I mean, I think if he's, this is going to be a slate where those are both 1 o'clock games. The Giants play at 1, the Falcons play at 1. So if we get convincing news one way or the other on no limitations for either guy, I think I'll be, a little overweight in GPPs, especially, if the news breaks Saturday night or early Sunday morning, a lot of times then the ownership will follow. But if it doesn't come out till maybe we get closer to inactives, a lot of people have their lineups built already. I think I'd be more inclined to be overweight. I don't really have a strong preference among them. I mean, I think in terms of our projections, I think Patterson grades out a little bit better on a points per dollar basis. Barkley maybe with a higher floor, but I think both are interesting for sure.
So the Dolphins are signing like Philip Lindsay to their team. They're calling up everybody on their practice squad. They don't really, like Salvon Ahmed, I guess, is what's going on out there. I'm not exactly sure what the scenario is, but nobody gives a crap about Myles Gaskin still. He's 5.6 on DraftKings. I have to reduce his ownership level manually every single week because based on how he's projected, he should be higher owned, like basically all the time. So is this a situation where you think that against Carolina, his passing game role could come into focus again? Or is it just going to be another situation where he's going to pop in there with a solid fantasy performance, not break the slate, not really do much for our lineups, but one time this season has he actually helped somebody win a GPP? So are we right to be ignoring Myles Gaskin despite the projection?
I don't know. I kind of like him here. Carolina is allowing the fewest passing yards per game in the league. They're a little bit weaker against the run. So perhaps this is a game where you see Miami look to establish that a little bit more. Now, granted, he can get his 20, what the heck did he do last week? 23 carries for 89 yards and no touchdowns. And he did catch a touchdown. So salvage the day that way. But, if they will probably have trouble throwing the ball down the field against that Carolina secondary. So I think he could get a lot more short passes again this week. And those are the 2 games this year. He had the one with double-digit catches, I think, where he did, break a slate. So, yeah, I like Gaskin this week. I think that given the spot and the fact that he always, gets a little bit under-owned and the salary's a little tough, I don't mind putting him in some lineups here.
All right. So the rest of the 10% plus range that we'll talk about here in the chalk section is a little bit dicey. You mentioned Ty Johnson earlier. I'm going to mention Dontrell Hilliard. Look, nobody knows who the hell Dontrell Hilliard is, Cards. I mean, he's been in the league for a little while, but he's 4.6, and the Titans are scraping for any kind of passing game options. I'm worried that they're not going to do anything on offense in this game, but you're going to see projections, including ours, that look half decent for the 4.6 price tag on a slate where you need some salary savings. And I think, first of all, is 11% too much for the ownership? And then second of all, can you actually look at either Johnson or Hilliard, these passing game backs on DraftKings specifically as options when we are trying to save a little bit of salary and there's not much out there to do it?
Yeah, I prefer Johnson. I think, and I know it's a little bit of a leap of faith because he touched the ball twice last week, but he had 8 targets against Buffalo, 6 against Cincinnati, 7 against New England. And Michael Carter has been serving that role of, catching a ton of passes out of the backfield. They are playing Houston in what should be a competitive game. And, so maybe he gets a little bit more rushing production. Like, I'm not worried about Coleman getting the lion's share of touches or P. Ryan or anybody like that. So given that I share your opinion that I think Tennessee is going to struggle to do much of anything consistently on offense. So if I'm taking a leap of faith with one of them with some pass catching ability, it's Johnson over Hilliard for me.
Yeah, I hated every second of trying to figure out his fantasy points and our fantasy point projections when I was looking him over yesterday. I knew that, by the numbers, he's going to have a projection that looks decent. But man, if there's any way to justify reducing their efficiency, that's definitely going to happen before Sunday, as far as I'm concerned, because I think New England is going to smash. Anything else here at running back before we move on to the wide receiver position that you feel compelled to talk about with the chalk?
Yeah, no, I think that's about it for the chalk. I think one of my favorite GPP angles is going to be going for the 8K running backs in the single digits in terms of ownership. You've got Najee Harris at 8,200 and you've got Eckler at 8,400. And I don't care whichever guy you want to take a stand on. I think taking a stand on one of these guys in GPPs makes sense. Like, Harris has been the guy for Pittsburgh this year, and he got banged up in the Sunday night game against the Chargers. So, don't worry about his numbers that much from that game. But the last time that Pittsburgh played Cincinnati, they fell behind, and Cincinnati, they played the soft coverage, and Harris had 19 targets in that game. He caught 14 passes for 102 yards. I'm not saying that's going to happen again, but we know he's going to get the lion's share of touches for them offensively. And then Eckler, coming off a 4 touchdown game, they're using him more in the red zone. We know he's going to get the passing game volume. And, there's those red zone looks that were always the biggest knock on his game. And particularly if you're, looking for some leverage against either the chalky value running backs, or you don't want to pay 9K plus for Taylor or McCaffrey, then I think Harris and Eckler are really interesting. Like, they are guys that could have GPP breaking type of games. We saw it from Eckler just last week at single digit ownership. So I like Harris and Eckler as contrarian options there.
I don't think Eckler will get the short squeeze on every fantasy site out there, but I think on DraftKings, it's pretty likely that he'll get to like maybe 10%, maybe even a little bit under the way it's projected now. So a little bit later in the show, Justin, we'll ask you to take a stand on some of these low-owned plays and tell us the one that's going to be in the winner, because that's what we're going to need to know. All right, let's get into the wide receiver position where, look, if you want to play in the DFS OGs league and come at these guys, why aren't shouldn't you be a DFS OG? Like, we got Beer Makers Fan, Head Chopper, Notorious. Don't they need to like get you involved in this, right? I mean, you've been doing this forever.
I got the short squeeze on that. So I'll have to pine to be the fourth wheel next year.
So here's what you need to do, Justin. You need to go to our homepage and find the DFS OGs contest, and you need to get in there and you need to kick their asses for not letting you in the club. Because let's face it, like, these guys out there, I mean, they've been delivering the information and the good stuff for years. Head Chopper, Noto, all these guys. Get in on FanDuel and kick their asses. All right, let's get into the wide receiver position. I was going to say, probably see Chris Godwin in that contest in one of their lineups because, quite frankly, Tom Brady is playing better than he ever has before, which is insane. But,
wild.
People say that every single week, so I'm not going to rehash this situation. We just accept it as fact and look at Chris Godwin and say, hey, he's the kind of guy that is going to get looks. The question is, every week, is it Godwin or is it Evans? Who is going to be the beneficiary of the Tom Brady touchdown love this week?
Yeah, I have a bias towards Godwin just in general because of his athleticism, but it's pretty clear that Brady likes Evans. I mean, he's scored in 4 straight. And if you go back last 6 games, Evans has 8 touchdowns. And I mean, always with his size, he's always, a red zone target. And so I think, in terms of yardage, I'm always going to give the edge to Godwin. If you're looking for multiple touchdowns, I think Evans at this point has proven his connection with Brady that he's the better bet. But touchdowns are variants, so it's a fickle beast. But hard to ignore with the touchdowns Evans has been putting up.
Yeah, it's definitely a Sophie's choice situation because now you've got Gronk playing well too.
Right. And Gronk is cheap on DraftKings.
Yeah, he found the fountain of youth. So, it's not easy to figure out how you want to structure your Tampa Bay Buccaneers stack if you're playing in like a 3-max scenario and you can only, pick, if you're not going to play all Brady lineups, you're not going to have every combination. So good luck to you out there. I kind of like Gronk this week. So we'll talk about that at tight end. Keenan Allen is going to be popular. Denver, the defense is considered to be one of the, the tougher matchups in the league. But I think at this point, the Chargers have such a consolidated workload share that you mentioned Eckler, Keenan Allen. I mean, these two guys are pretty much where you can expect a lot of targets to go each and every week. And I don't think on DraftKings it's a bad idea to go back to Allen. Is it a mistake to trust him in a tournament scenario, though, because of the high ownership?
I don't think it's necessarily a mistake. I mean, the dude has 4 straight games of at least 11 targets, so they're going to be there. I mean, if you're looking for a pivot, basically if you're looking for somebody in the same price range, you just want somebody that's going to outscore him or match him if he's a little bit cheaper. So I don't think it's a mistake if you go there because the likelihood of a floor game, if we sort wide receivers by floor on DraftKings, the only wide receiver we have with a higher floor is Devontae Adams. And we even have Allen ahead of Cooper Kupp. So I don't think it's a mistake to play him. Whether or not, you subscribe to the theory of wanting to fade the high ownership and try to get a guy that has can have a ceiling game ahead of Allen, I think is certainly a viable discussion, but I can't fade him entirely if I'm doing like 50, 100 lineups this week.
Ownership, of course, doesn't exist in a vacuum. Your total lineup usage always matters, and inevitably, fading too much of a player because of individual player ownership is never a great idea. You want to look at how the entire lineup is structured, but certainly, we do want to try to find some guys that we can get a little bit of an edge on if we take an underweight position on, go lower in our own individual ownership than the field's ownership, and try not to feel the brunt of a lower range of outcomes game. I don't necessarily think Allen's going to be at a huge risk of busting you this week. So I will have him in my player pool when I go to build my teams. Brandon Cooks is the guy that I'm going to have in my player pool right now. 5.8 against the Jets. Boy, it's tough to look at this and not think that his ownership couldn't even be even higher. Is he actually going to be even higher than 20% on the way I have it?
He might be. And you consider that a lot of people are going to take a look at Tyrod Taylor and Cooks. And the thing is, if you build a Taylor Cooks lineup, you have more freedom in salary for the other positions than a lot of other people will. And so the cautionary tale with that is you just mentioned it, looking at your total lineup ownership as a whole, it's pretty easy to build a Taylor Cooks lineup that looks like what a lot of other Taylor Cooks lineups are going to look like. So even though the aggregate ownership on Taylor isn't all that high, you're going to have a lot of Taylor Cooks lineups that look the same because of the freedom that it gives you to spend up for other chalkier high dollar plays. So that's my concern with Cooks. I don't think it's a mistake if you're looking to fade him. I mean, you look at the other high dollar, high ownership wide receivers that have receiving props of 6.5 catches, 7.5 catches. And that's where Cooks makes his hay, is with just sheer volume. And his receiving prop this week is only 5.5 catches with juice on the under. So depending on what book you're looking at. So yeah, I don't love Cooks in a vacuum there with that ownership, which could maybe reach 25.
Yeah. But again, that's another situation where, by all means, if you're making a lot of teams, I don't think you're going to often find people who are going to go with 0 Cooks, but I think if you're going to see that kind of high ownership on him, I have an interesting guy that I want to talk about a little later. Boy, I might be giving it away, but it's scary as all hell. But it's certainly a situation where if you like this situation with the Texans against the Jets, it might be another way you can go. Okay, so Debo just absolutely crushing it. Running the ball last week. He's certainly had big games on numerous occasions this season. Focal point of the offense for the 49ers. Definitely has the athleticism to back up this breakout season that we're seeing from him. I think a lot of people were expecting this for him at some point in his career. And I think the arrow hasn't even actually reached the peak yet. So my problem is when I look at Deebo Samuel, he's in this explosive kind of matchup with the Vikings. He's going to be pretty owned, but do I even care? I mean, this guy is good for 15 fantasy points pretty much week in and week out. And I'm afraid to not have him. And I don't think I'm going to be on the sidelines again. I'm going to definitely have some Deebo. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, they're using him in so many different ways as clearly the most explosive player that they have offensively, that I think it's a mistake. We talked earlier about a mistake to fade him. I mean, we talked earlier about the number of shootouts that the Vikings are playing in. This game has one of the highest totals of the slate. So definitely hard to fade Deebo here.
I also find it pretty compelling to look at a guy like Deontay Johnson against Cincinnati and say, yep, he's going to have 10 targets again. How am I supposed to look at this guy who gets 13 targets, but it takes him like 15 targets to get 100 yards half the time. But it's at some point in time, he's going to have to combine some of this target volume with some super efficiency and just have a monster, right? There's no way that you can go through your entire career at 6 yards per target or whatever he is.
I assume that will improve once a different quarterback is under center there.
Oh,
if they get a halfway decent quarterback when Ben hangs it up, we'll see a little bit more efficiency on the targets from Deontay Johnson. But I mean, I like him a lot. I was, kind of hoping he'd end up checking in at a little lower ownership this week, but the guy has 13 targets in 4 of the last 5 games, and you can't ignore that. I mean, with Juju Smith-Schuster out, he is the guy there. He is the safety valve. It's basically him and Harris getting, 50 to 60% target share in that offense. So I like Johnson a lot. I like Michael Pittman a lot as well. He's going to be right there in terms of ownership. And particularly if you're thinking Taylor's a little priced out or a tougher matchup for the running game for Indy this week, if they're going to throw, it's going to be to Pittman. And it's a little bit of a leap of faith. His numbers the last few weeks haven't been great, but they just blitzed Buffalo last week, so they didn't really need to throw. Another guy that I was maybe kind of hoping would fly under the radar a little bit this week, but people are smart. Everyone's using solid projections here. So I like Pittman. I like Deontay Johnson. I think those are the 2 high-owned guys that I really want to make sure I play this week.
And you put your signature on that on your conviction plays for the week. So I like to see you standing up for those guys here in this segment. Jerry Jeudy, boy, the Chargers are a team that are definitely easier to run the ball against than they are to throw against. They got Asante Samuel, they got Chris Harris Jr., they got a bunch of good players, Derwin James back there in that secondary, plus some guys who can rush the passer. But Jeudy is certainly a guy at 5,500 that's going to attract some attention. Good route runner, the kind of guy that I would be less worried about playing against some of these tougher secondary members than I would be other I guess more lunky wide receivers in the league. Do you think that Jeudy is, first of all, is he going to be popular the way that I'm showing it? And second of all, are you willing to play a guy who's this popular on a team that probably wants to get out there and run the ball?
Yeah, that's the key for me. I just think, the targets the last couple weeks, 8 and 9, pretty good. But that's probably as much as he's getting, unless they're getting blitzed, which, this game has 2.5 point spread. And I think that Denver will, as I mentioned earlier, I think they'll try to slow this game down. So everything has to go right for him to hit that GPP ceiling, which we have. I mean, we have him, see what the lowest ceiling of any of the highest owned wide receivers. None of the double-digit owned receivers have a lower ceiling other than Des Fitzpatrick, which is probably not the best company you want to be in with there. So, yeah, I'm probably out on Jeudy here, especially with him only being 100 cheaper than Pittman. I'll stick with Pittman.
I think if you made ceiling projections based purely on what this player's raw ability is to have monster games, I think Judy's he'd be way higher. But just the situation he finds himself in Denver and is not exceptionally conducive to the 40-point game. I think he'll probably have one in his career at some point. I just don't think we're going to see it this week or maybe even this year. Mike, okay, so guys that we have seen monster games from in the past, Kupp and Adams, their ownership will be suppressed a little bit because of how expensive they are. I'm not going to get into talking about how good these guys are. You play them if you can afford them, okay? Des Fitzpatrick, I mentioned briefly earlier, will get some ownership. Cards, who the hell are the Titans going to play at wide receiver this
I
week?
don't know.
I mean, you're not playing Nick Westbrook, Akina. I mean, maybe you are, but I mean, I
Chester Rogers.
Yeah, look, I mean, what are you going to say? I mean, if one of these guys ends up getting a lot of volume, Tannehill's good enough to pump their production up in any given week. But New England's a tough out, and I have concerns about whether this offense is going to stay on the field. So, Dez is 33.2. He scored a touchdown last week. How do you feel about this? Is it can you even breathe on this?
No, not really. I share your opinion. I think they might get blitzed, but I guess that means they'll simply just have to keep throwing. And so somebody's got to get some targets and catch the ball. I mean, if you look at their snap counts from last week, Brown 42, Westbrook Akine 54, Chester Rogers 56, Des Fitzpatrick 64. So those are the guys that are, I mean, with Brown out this week, those are the guys that are going to be out there. How efficient they will be is another matter. Like I simply put, double-digit ownership. I'm not playing Des Fitzpatrick. I'm not.
I wouldn't be surprised if he slipped under double-digit ownership just because everyone's going to look at this and be like, who the hell is this? But at the same time, if they do follow the letter of the law on the projections, technically speaking, if he's going to be, if he can score as many as 16 to 18 points or something like that on a ceiling, you wouldn't mind that at 3.2, especially on this slate.
Yeah, okay, for sure. So, yeah, I get it. Just probably not doing it.
3 last names here above 10% in the current projections: DJ Moore, Kenny Golladay, and Justin Jefferson. Let's look at Golladay really quickly here. Do you think that people are going to jump? They don't have any receivers there in New York, by the way. No one's talking about that. Do you think Golladay is going to jump right in here and have any chance at production?
I do. I think he's got a shot at it. Yeah. I'm more curious. Like if there's one guy where I'd be really interested to see the pulse of everybody. If there was a guy I could try to pick, I think Galladay is a really tough guy to peg where that ownership's going to go this week. I think you could say 6% and I could believe it. I think you could say 16% and I could maybe believe it, that, depending on how the news cycle goes throughout the next 24 hours or so. But you mentioned they just don't have a lot of guys. A game that could, in theory, turn into a sneaky shootout. And if the Giants fall behind, I could see Golladay being an interesting slate breaker this week. And I'm not sure where everybody's at on him just because of, the injuries and the general ineffectiveness of that offense.
Do yourself a favor. If you want to listen to STL Cards and a bunch of other guys talk to you via your podcast app on a frequent basis, go ahead and subscribe to this feed on the RG Podcast Network on Apple or your favorite podcast app. You can also go ahead and like this if you're listening or rather say watching on YouTube, and go ahead and help yourself out as well as us in the process and get alerted when these shows come out. Okay, so tight end position. Keep this a little bit short because the tight end position is always the same conversation every week. You've got maybe one or two of the top guys. We'll call Goddard and Gronkowski the guys that you'd expect to be up here because they're relatively strong projections with relatively strong matchups, and certainly people are going to own these guys. Go ahead and play them if you like them. The guy that I really want to take a look at here is Evan Ingram at 3.8 on DraftKings. Ingram is a very tough play on most weeks just because he's just continually disappointing us for years at this point in time. He's got the athleticism to be, almost a wide receiver, and yet still can't find a way to get it done at the tight end position. It seems at this point that this is who he is. Are we going to be rewarded for our continuous faith in Ingram with what should be elevated target share this week, or is this going to be yet another spot where he disappoints us?
Yet another spot where he disappoints us. If the past data is any indication, that's what's going to happen. I mean, I think you need to sprinkle in either Golladay or Ingram because or Barkley, somebody's going to at least do something. Unlike Tennessee, where we think they might just be stuck in neutral the whole game, I do think the Giants will be able to move the ball. And you're not looking at exorbitant ownership around, 10, 12, 14%, whatever we've got on Barkley, Golladay and Ingram there. So I think you got to sprinkle in, at least take a stand on one of the guys that you want to play in your GPPs, because I do think there's going to be a really strong point per dollar performance, because it's not like Galladay, given the recent production, he's not all that expensive. Ingram obviously isn't expensive. Barkley isn't all that expensive. So yeah, I think you got to play somebody. I don't blame you if you don't want to play Ingram because of what we've seen from him. He is 3,800. I'll probably keep him in my player pool because tight end is really bad this week. Andrews in a primetime game. The Chiefs aren't on the main slate this week. We saw a lot of, we saw our traditional 80 touchdowns from tight ends on showdown slates in the 3-game Thursday slate. That's what happens every showdown. So we don't have a ton of elite tight ends on this slate. So I'll probably keep Ingram in my player pool, but I think you need to focus on one or two of those kind of cheaper Giants plays this week.
You'll see the ownership's DraftKings specific for Ingram. No one's playing him on other sites. They're going to play Kittle. They're going to play Kyle Pitts. They're going to play Goddard and Gronkowski. You'll see you can afford the tight ends on other sites. FanDuel and Yahoo specifically. On DraftKings is where you might need some of that savings a little bit more. Just a couple notes here. I think Freiermuth might actually get a little bit of ownership here on this slate. It's possible people go to Dan Arnold again, but probably less than we've seen lately. And then maybe because of the stack, you'll see Jared Cook out there, creeping up, into the high single digits. It says 10.1% right now in the projections. I'll probably try to tick that down just a little bit, but he'll be far from unowned. I'll put it to you that way. All right, let's get into the defenses. Just real quick. Only two defenses I think even worth mentioning on the slate right now, just from an ownership perspective, are the Texans and the Jaguars, because no one plays these guys any other week. Now they're 2.3 and 2.2 on DraftKings, and now they're going to be like a third of the ownership, and I don't think that's wrong. Well, I mean, Justin, what are we doing here? What's happening?
It's not wrong because you need the salary, and we're just desperate for any sort of salary relief. It reminds me, you mentioned the DFS OGs earlier. One of the early daily fantasy sites, Draft Street, 1 week, their average salaries were like $5,000-$6,000 for a defense, a different type of cap. But 1 week they made the Jets like $200 against a really, really good offense. I don't remember all the specifics anymore. It's been so many years, but and everybody, people wanted to play them just because they were so cheap. So this reminds me of that a little bit. But yeah, I mean, look, the Jets are going to start Zach Wilson, so I get it with the Texans, but I don't know. Defensive scoring is just so variant that it just makes me uncomfortable to play a 20% owned defense. And I don't maybe just play it for the block and move on, but I don't know. Like, where do you stand on the chalky defense theory in general in GPPs?
Well, I think it was a little bit easier to play this angle before the pricing started to get so strictly tight, right? And not only that, like, where are the kick return touchdowns these days, Justin?
Yeah,
like,
you got so many guys booming it through the end zone. It just, there aren't any.
So I mean, you're getting more limited in your options for those massive games. Offense is better than it's ever been before. I think it's more difficult to fade the higher round defenses than it has been in the past. But I still do tend to try to find, like if I can find an option, if I can make lines without the Texans this week, I'm still going to try because it's the Texans and they're 2.3. But if the difference is one of these other defenses actually has to do something instead, and if the Texans go off, you're done. So it's very tough situation nowadays with the way that defensive scoring has changed, but I still do generally prescribe to the idea that in a highly variant position, you want to try to avoid ownership if you can.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Panthers are interesting. They're 800 more. I think the Steelers are somewhat interesting. They're 400 more. They're like 2,700, so not super expensive. And maybe about a third of the ownership there. So, look, I get the logic behind the Texans and the Jags, and I'm probably not going to fade them completely just because we need that salary relief, but Panthers, Steelers, I think a couple teams you could look at if you're looking for pivots that aren't, 3,900 like New England is.
All right. Enough of the defensive takes, Justin. People who are here to watch for low-owned plays need the winners. They need you to dig deep into your bag and tell us if we're playing like a monster GPP, if we're in like the Millionaire Maker or the Slant or something, we want to get deep. I want you to find me a low-owned option at every single position here that you think you can say with conviction has a chance to be one of those slingshot. I don't remember if I said it on the show last week, but I was certainly in the Slack channel. I was talking about Joe Flacco last week as a joke. He ended up winning the Millionaire Maker, I think.
So it was pretty good last week.
So no pick will be laughed out of the room here, Justin. Give us a low-owned quarterback that you think could have that chance of that once in a lifetime score?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's Cousins. If you're going a little bit lower in terms of ownership, if you need me to go under 2%, maybe Carson Wentz, pair him up with Pittman. But Cousins, for me, I mean, I know that offense can be frustrating, but the guy hasn't thrown an interception in 6 weeks. 294 yards, 2 scores against the Chargers, 341 yards, 3 scores against the Packers. We know that their defense is, allowing a few more points nowadays. And I think that game could shoot out. So for me, Cousins at quarterback, maybe Wentz if you're looking to go a little deeper.
I'm still waiting for one of these rookies to just have like an actually good daily fantasy game. Some combination or one of the two guys, either Mac Jones or Trevor Lawrence. I've tried it a couple of times already this year. 2 pretty abysmal failure. Boy, Trevor Lawrence, Justin, you play college football DFS, right? Like, what is this guy ever going to do it in the NFL? I mean, I know he's on the Jaguars and everything. Could this be the week where he actually shows up and gets in the end zone a couple of times? He has like no multi-touchdown games. He's not running the ball anywhere near at the level we know he's capable of. I mean, is it possible for him to hit that ceiling?
I don't think so with their, given the talent that they have at receiver and the fact that James Robinson's healthy again. I don't think you're going to see them open it up enough. Like if they opened it up more and they let him run and they design some more creative plays, like it's almost like a lesser version of Matt Nagy with Justin Fields. Like the offense isn't designed for him to have that ceiling. So certainly I think that this game is maybe more possible than the others, but I don't know. I just don't see it happening right now.
I have more confidence in the Mac Jones skinny stack because he's only 5.4. Like a couple of different things that could happen here. They could smash the Titans and, you don't even don't bring it back. Just go with just to save some salary, Mac Jones and one of the cheaper wide receivers or tight ends and hope that you can get one rushing touchdown from Mac on the 1 yard QB sneak, right? Like that could certainly happen. They do that with the Tom Brady play in New England, but you don't need to rely exclusively on that. I think at 5.4, one of these two guys on the cheap gives you an outside chance. If you're thinking about Zach Wilson, forget it. This guy stinks. Who do you got at running back?
It's definitely not Zach Wilson. Agreed there. Kind of gave this away a little bit earlier, but I think Harris and Eckler, one of those two guys is going to be on the winning GPP lineups this week at single digit ownership. Eckler is going to be a little more popular on the other sites, as you mentioned earlier, with the salary on DraftKings, he gets a little bit squeezed out, but Harris is not a guy that's going to be super popular at all because his passing volume doesn't give you that much, upside on FanDuel with half point PPR. And so I think Najee Harris could be that guy. Had that huge game the first time when they played the Bengals, could certainly happen again. So I like Harris. If you're going really, really, really deep, it's tough to find guys at running back, like until we get clarity on what the Packers are going to do. If Aaron Jones happens to be out, then maybe Dylan soaks up a lot more ownership and you get more guys at single digits. But, Javonte Williams could be another guy too, if he's going to be in a workhorse role there for Denver now. He could be that kind of sneakier value this week. But Harris is the guy I'll probably be the most overweight on.
I'll dovetail off the Javonte Williams. That was the guy I was going to name, and it was exclusively because I do think that attacking the Chargers is definitely something that you prefer to do on the ground versus through the air. The Broncos are just fine doing that. That's for sure. If they end up playing good defense and controlling the game, even for a portion of the game at the beginning, and we start to see a lot of carries come out of the Denver backfield, if it happens to be an unusual split in the favor of Williams and he gets in the box at 5.2 here on DraftKings, that could end up yielding some good positive results on a tougher week. Who do you got at wide receiver?
Yeah, I think there's a couple guys. If you look at kind of point per dollar and kind of check out ceiling, the guy that stands out to me there is Elijah Moore. Now, it worries me more. I kind of wish for his perspective, I wish it was Flacco again under center. But you look at the guy's targets, 6, 6, 8, 6, 11 the last 5 weeks. He scored the last 3 games. He had the big game last week. And still not going to be all that owned. I mean, we got him at 3% on Yahoo, 1 or 2% on FanDuel, 6% on DraftKings. And I think he is the guy that, again, Zach Wilson makes him a lot more volatile, but he's a fantastic receiver, a guy that has a bright future in this league. He's reasonably affordable. So Moore is my guy there. Maybe Darius Slayton again, if you subscribe to the theory of the Giants doing something and you don't trust Galladay or Ingram. Slayton had 7 targets last week. I suppose you could go there, but Elijah Moore I do like for the upside.
I'm just going to mention something, not because I think it's something I want to play on most sites, but I just thought about, I saw Cortland Sutton was $10 on Yahoo. So like, if you're playing on Yahoo, by the way, out there, you're looking for a value play, Cortland Sutton is $10. Don't ask me how that just crossed my mind scrolling down the list here, but it is something I definitely wanted to make sure I point out.
That's confirmed. It is $10.
That's a little strange here. Man, I don't really want to like say that Jamar Chase is going to be low owned, but I do think that the matchup versus Pittsburgh could suppress his ownership just a little bit. And lest we forget, this is the guy who has like, the 40, 50 point upside that, you used to see from, some of the biggest names in the business. I mean, if he ends up, breaking a couple of long touchdowns, you're going to need him to win. And I don't think that versus Pittsburgh precludes him from doing that. So if he's going to be under 10% owned, which is certainly very possible on this slate, I think Jamar Chase is a player to definitely not forget about. Nobody's going to forget about him. They're just going to scroll right past him when they can't afford him. So go ahead and try to find a lineup for 2 that includes him. You got a tight end?
Yeah. Tight end stinks this week. And I think for that reason, you just go for a punt. First of all, I love Kittle on DraftKings in single digits. Don't sleep on him if you can afford him. And he's a little tougher to get on DraftKings. I love Kittle and Freiermuth as well. He's super talented, but we got Kittle at 8%, Freiermuth at 6%. Don't mind going back to Dan Arnold as well at 4K. He didn't have a target last week, but otherwise 7, 10 the previous 3 games. But Kittle and Freiermuth will be the 2 that I try to go overweight on.
I think Pitts actually has a chance to get open this week. So if he's actually open, he'll certainly be someone who could have a big game. I don't think the ownership is going to be excessive on him. So he's a player that I do like for a considerable upside in week number 12. Folks, that is going to do it for the ownership report. And I wish you the best of luck in all of your daily fantasy contests. For Justin Van Zuiden, I'm Chris Gimino. We'll be back again in week 13. Go win something.